Now in this class, and I think pretty much every class, in fact I couldn't think of one in which I didn't, I refer to what I call traditional countries and more modern countries. And when I refer to a traditional country, I mean those that have not completed the process of modernization, that have not transitioned completely from being a developing third world country to an industrialized first world country. And you'll hear about this in various ways, I think, in every sociology course you will take. And again, I actually sat and thought if there are any courses, mine or others, where you wouldn't discuss this, and the only one I could think of were stats and methods courses. Reference is made to this in every sociology course because sociology is the study of society. And going through the process of modernization includes industrialization and urbanization. Or not, and this will affect every single aspect of family life you can think of. So for this course in particular, it's really important. I've talked extensively in other courses about the effect of this process on things like women's health in terms of their fertility, the declining need to have large families, then the actual need to have smaller families, the emergence of birth control and access to it. Before we even get to fertility, how modernization has affected things like the emergence of dating, mate selection, family involvement in mate selection. How modernization has affected how people eat, how much they eat, how they gain access to food, what they eat. The emergence of a formal education system, access to education affected by socioeconomic status. So when I in the text say that modernization has affected every single part of family life, and of society as a whole, this is not overstating the situation. In our last class, I mentioned Dr. Peter Berger and his view of the social categories we fit into. Remember, I talked about how they're tied to the sociological imagination. In his work, he also studied modernization, how that affected society that is relevant to any discussion of families, and he identified certain features of a society that change when it modernizes, that completely affect family life on an individual daily basis, as well as the role of families overall in society. First, he says that there is a decline of small cohesive communities in which social interaction occurs within primary groups of family and close friends. Absolutely, this has occurred and is continuing to occur in countries that are still going through modernization. Imagine for a moment that you live in a rural area, your family are farmers, you and everyone else in the family is required to work alongside your parents every single day to sustain the family, and of course there's no vehicles and no phones. I know it's really hard to realistically imagine yourself in that situation, but try. Who would you spend 99% of your time with? Who would you speak to 99% of the time? Who would you rely on for support and recognition and everything you need socially as a human being in order to survive? It would be your family, perhaps a few close friends, and that is it. You would simply not have much contact at all with anybody else. And whatever contact you did have with non-family members would occur once a week at church for a few hours. That is the only social contact outside your family you would have. And that's another feature that Dr. Berger identifies as a consequence of modernization, a decline in the importance of religious institutions. Because of industrialization and urbanization, small, tight-knit communities in which pretty much everybody stayed put in one place were dissolved more and more. And at the same time this was occurring, there was a decline in religiosity in society overall. People relied less and less on religion. They relied on it less and less as a cornerstone of their life, as a guide for them in life. It simply became less prominent and less influential. Instead, as Emile Durkheim said, there was a rise of individualism. Less emphasis on religion, more emphasis on people as individuals. Now, sure, some families are still religious. Some communities have a higher degree of religious participation. But in modern countries, the majority do not. And Dr. Berger said that modernization in a society, combined with this, causes tradition to decline and personal choice to increase. Not just in a religious sense, but overall, which completely ties back to reliance on one's family, socially speaking, and to less reliance on religion. Now, his last 2 points are that there is an increase in diversity and change, and that people tend to focus more on the future than they did before, both of which completely tie into characteristics of a modern society. So really take note that all of what he identifies as the consequences of modernization, all of them 100% tie into each other. They are completely reciprocal. There is absolutely no way to look at them in isolation. Kind of reminds me of a game of dominoes with one tile causing another to fall. And in the end, all the tiles are touching each other. That's what I think of when I think of Berger and his perspective of the effect of modernization on society. Now, he's not the only sociologist to study how modernization affects a society and the culture and people in it. What norms exist, what norms decrease. As I already said, Durkheim spoke about the rise of individualism. Karl Marx focused on the effect of industrialization and thus capitalism, as well as others. And then Ferdinand Tönnies, who was a German sociologist, who was also an economist and philosopher, is remembered for his work in sociological theory, and especially for his contributions regarding how modernization affects society. He said there are 2 kinds of society, one traditional, one modern, one that he called Gemeinschaft and one that he referred to as Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft refers to a traditional society. Translated, this actually means community. And this refers to what society was like when people lived in close-knit groups based on mutual bonds, like family or religion, so that they had closer primary relationships. In this society, there would be much more emphasis put on conforming, on following the same morals and values, and using these as a form of social control instead of formal means like laws and courts. Again, more of an emphasis on conforming. So think of Amish societies, Hutterite communities, even traditional Hasidic communities as examples of Gemeinschaft. The other kind of society that Tönnies identified he referred to as Gesellschaft, which means society. So the first one means community, the second means society. And he said that this kind of society emerged because of urbanization and industrialization. In this kind of community, there is an emphasis on individualism, on impersonal relationships, and more of an emphasis on being financially successful. So in this kind of society, rules are not implicit. They are actually recorded in formal law. And Tönnies really believed that Gesellschaft was the source of the demise of traditional family bonds and traditional family life. He said, leaving people to work for pay instead of working their own land and reaping the full benefit of their own work means they have a poorer life socially and morally, and a poorer life just in terms of their daily existence. And I want to be clear that these are not just theoretical ideas that Dr. Berger and Tönnies had, or Durkheim or Marx or any other sociologist who has spent time thinking about the effect of modernization on families. They might have different ideas about the exact effect, about which effect should receive the most attention, but all agree that modernization has undeniably changed what families are, the purpose they serve, how they come to be, how they function, what they contribute to society, etc., which is extremely, extremely, extremely important from a sociological point of view. Your text frames this information, referring to Dr. William J. Good and his specific ideas, which is okay and certainly not incorrect, but I would point out that the ideas and conclusions that Dr. Good presents are not really specific to him. Many people have since come to the same conclusions. And as it mentions, because of the process of industrialization, which then caused a need for urbanization for the first time, this meant large segments of the population left the family home to work, instead of just continuing to rely on their family as an economic unit of production. And this resulted in an entirely new system of employment in regards to the number of people working for a paycheck instead of working for themselves, as well as entirely new occupations being created and a much more specialized division of labor. So this contributed to more of a division of labor based on sex. Whereas women worked the family homestead, in a slightly different way than men. Now they were at home looking after children, completely removed from the labor that supported the family. This caused more importance being placed on what a person was able to achieve on their own, independent of their family, instead of their work and their individual identity being so closely tied to their family of origin. Now, a lot of this I've already alluded to in this class. I'm just restating it in a different way. If we get more specific and really consider how modernization changed families, not just society overall, and how modernization is currently affecting those countries who have yet to complete the process, the text and Dr. Good bring up a few things you might not necessarily think of. Well, let's look at the obvious effect first. One I've already alluded to, that there was a shift away from extended families. Industrialization necessitated people moving into more urban areas. They might not be what we would consider urban now, but they were considered urban at the time. So there was a sharp decline in rural communities. Those rural communities that remained were drastically reduced in size. And those people who moved for work had much less close contact with extended family because, they moved away. This is 100% the norm for us now. People move to go to school, they move for a job, they move for a promotion. I moved to London, Ontario at one point for school. I moved to Nunavut for a year for work. But when urbanization was first occurring, this had been completely unheard of. So it was a very, very significant difference. And it isn't only a decline in the closeness of family relationships, a decline in reliance on family relationships. It was also a decline in community, in tight-knit communities. Less of a reliance on community, less personal identification with a specific community. And as another extension, as you already know probably, families began to shrink smaller and smaller because having many children to ensure a family remained a viable economic unit of production was not only no longer necessary, it became a disadvantage because children cost money and they were no longer bringing in as much of an economic return. Very, very closely tied to a shift away from extended families and ties to communities being so prominent, modernization also lessened the need for kinship to be patrilineal in nature. And instead, kinship or family ties evolved to be bilateral, meaning it was just not as important for people to have specifically designated heirs based on their patrilineal kin. Imagine if every child that was born in a family was expected as an adult to live and work on the same piece of land that their parents did, mainly the sons. In that kind of society, this would mean that property ownership would be extremely important, and thus inheriting property would be extremely important. And so parents would be concerned about whose kinship ties were considered the most important. Because of modernization, the vast majority of people simply don't pay a lot of attention to specific people always inheriting certain things. Do we leave our worldly goods to our family members? Yeah, of course we do. But the concern about it always being a son or the oldest son, that kind of thing is just not really relevant for modern society. Modernization has also directly affected how most people find a mate. Not the first thing you'd think of in terms of the effect of modernization, is it? In traditional societies, and to this day in societies that are less modern, families play a much bigger role in who young people end up married to. This should not be surprising, since urbanization meant people were living in closer proximity to people they were not related to. There was no longer at least a couple miles between homes out in the country. Instead, they'd be on the next block. They'd be at school. They were more accessible. And in addition, when young people would meet each other in urban areas, there was more of a chance that this would occur without parents there, something that had never occurred before. And since young people were less and less interested in taking over family farms, property and inheritance were no longer as important when a marital match was made. You no longer had that economic concern, that descent concern, which created more room for emotion and feelings and even love to play a bigger role. What the young person really wanted, who they wanted to be with just because, was considered more important. Which I understand. If who I or my brothers married was going to have an effect on who inherited what, yeah, my parents would have had much more of a say in our marital relationships, understandably. Maybe you know somebody who has something specific in their will because of a marriage. Leaving somebody out of something, specifically stating if the person who will inherit something has passed on before them, not to have it go to their spouse. And finally, the last really major change that Dr. Good identified with the shift to modernization for families is that generally families became more egalitarian in nature, more equal, which again ties back into the previous points made like a game of dominoes. Because of modernization, families as a whole became less patriarchal. Men had less authority. Now, this doesn't mean families became equal, that the position of a wife or mother was suddenly on the same footing as that of her husband or father, but it did improve. In part, because when young people married, they were allowed more choice in their marriage partner, as already explained. Marriages were less commonly based on an economic partnership or economic stability, and more commonly became based on a relationship between the people getting married. And that's very, very significant. Okay, so as I wrap up the academic part of this, the last main thing from the text I want to touch on is world systems theory. And I'm going to directly quote the text here. Changes in families can be traced to changing global economic markets and political structures. Nations, cultures, and family norms do not exist in isolation. Rather, every country is inextricably tied to others in the world, end quote. That is world systems theory. And to me, what's an easy way to think of world systems theory? I see very definite similarities between that and the sociological imagination on a global scale. So remember, the sociological imagination is all about recognizing how we as individuals are linked to everything in our society, both from the past and the present. Well, world systems theory is all about how every country is linked to every other in various ways, and thus how every country affects each other and thus the families within them. So not in as innocent a manner as the sociological imagination, and it's focused mainly on economics. Emanuel Wallerstein was an American sociologist and economic historian who was always interested in politics. Not surprising, since his parents were Polish Jews who moved because of World War I, eventually reaching the U.S. Dr. Wallerstein took a look at the world as a whole And he said, in the world, we have core countries, semi-periphery countries, and periphery countries, with the core countries at the top, the semi-periphery in the middle, and the periphery at the bottom. And these are these core countries are countries that are industrialized first world countries that other countries depend on because they control the global market. And core countries benefit from the global market more than everybody else. They have a wide variety of resources. They're generally well off. Their political systems are generally stable, and they have been for a long time. Their populations tend to be well educated. They have a high rate of literacy. Core countries are in the best position. However, these core countries end up exploiting other countries. At the moment, core countries, according to the world system theory, include the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Those are the core countries, as you can see here. The dark blue, not the purpley blue, but the dark blue. Those are the core countries. So they're countries that are the strongest in pretty much every way. Doesn't mean they're the perfect, but compared to the other countries, they're in a very good position. You take one step down, and we have the semi-periphery countries. These are the ones that are purple. They are still in the process of industrializing. These are countries that do a lot of manufacturing, a lot of exporting, and they have the potential of becoming a core country. But if you think of this like an economic hierarchy, they're not at the top like the core countries are. Now, they're not at the bottom either. And in some ways, they act as a link between the core and the semi-periphery. These include countries like China, Argentina, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and small countries like Israel, Poland, and Greece. And then at the bottom, in the least desirable position, we have periphery countries. These are not industrialized. These are what I would call traditional countries. They are underdeveloped. Their social institutions are not as stable. Their political systems are often not as stable. They don't have a well-established formal education system. Not always, but often even their health system is in need of serious assistance. And because of all these reasons, the periphery countries are commonly reliant on others for assistance and aid. Why is this relevant for a discussion of family? And in particular, a discussion of the history of family structure and function. Well, if you think the way our world is now, the different countries in it, how each country came to be the way it is today, the fact is, many countries came into being due to direct exploitation of other countries. Think of it like an onion, with layer after layer that makes up the onion, and thus with every part of a country's economy filtering through level after level until it reaches the core of the onion, which is the family. And looking at the history of the world, the fact is it includes a great deal of colonization, a great deal of imperialism, in which one country would extend its rule over another, and all of this was motivated by economic gain, all of which directly affected the family structure in every country, hence its relation to discussions about the historical development of family structures. Now, if we look at India as an example, I hesitate whether to identify India as a periphery country or a semi-periphery country, because it is such a large country that different parts of the country fit each. This is a country I actually would have chosen myself for an example of the effect of modernization, because there are some parts that are at least somewhat modernized, while others have not even begun the process. So it provides more than one picture of family historically and presently. Right now, in present time, we can really see all of these processes occurring at various rates in various parts of the country, since it's not an entirely modern country. And as different parts of India become more modern, other parts remain very traditional and agricultural, with almost no outside influence at all. So within one country, we see the different effects modernization has had and is continuing to have. On one hand, large parts of the country are impoverished. Not just poor, but impoverished, so that maintaining a minimal level of food, clothing, and shelter is a struggle. The country has a poorly constructed and poorly implemented, unstable education system, and thus high rates of illiteracy for men and women. Its economy in some areas is not advanced, so that people barely are able to survive. And even though the caste system was abolished several decades ago, socially it is still prominent, so that people classified as Dalit, the lowest class, are still strongly discriminated against. India has a high fertility rate, and currently its population has a youth bulge, which means that a significant proportion of the population is younger. In 2020, the average age in India was 29. Compare that to 37 in the US. And in order to keep up with this youth bulge, the country needs to create 10 million new jobs every year. 10 million. Now, the government has tried to do what it can to decrease fertility. Women being aware of contraception is not an issue. Being able to access it easily has been. So the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in India, which is responsible for creating and implementing family planning on a wide scale, has implemented several campaigns in order to reach the goal of decreasing the fertility rate to 2.1 per woman by 2025. So in 2017, they launched the Mission Parivar Vikas, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the MPV, which is a family planning initiative designed to improve access to contraceptives. And it's going to do this by improving healthcare services for women, making access to good quality family planning services easier for women, providing more options for family planning as well. So they introduced 2 new contraceptives. One is an injectable that will last for up to 3 months, and one is a birth control pill, but instead of taking it daily, you only need to take it once a week. This initiative also includes things like TV commercials and posters and billboards, radio shows, and a website dedicated to family planning, although of course clearly a website in a country with a very high rate of poverty and illiteracy is not going to be as effective as it would elsewhere. Now, in some parts of India, as in China, there is a very problematic sex disparity, as male children are wanted more than female, because there's more of an economic and social benefit associated with sons. This is a big part of the reason why girls are also likely, remember, to have no education, because when they grow up, they're married and they'll likely live with their husband's family. A multi-generational family unit is still very common, but actual living arrangements may vary quite a bit depending on what region a family lives in and their socioeconomic status. At the same time, many live in nuclear families, a couple with their unmarried children, as is the norm here. And even for those that live within a nuclear family structure in India, they tend to have much stronger family ties, much stronger networks of kinship ties through which they provide family members economic assistance or whatever kind of assistance is needed. So it's still very common for extended family to live in very close proximity to each other, even if not in the same household, and to have more of an automatic obligation to extended family even once married. If we compare that to, so multi-generational household. Now, if we compare that to Japan, India was a good example because it's a country of economic contrast. Japan is a good example for looking at how history has affected the development of family, because it has such a distinct contrast in terms of being a really highly modern and developed country, economically speaking, but socially is still deeply steeped in tradition, especially in regard to gender and thus family life. If you haven't already, read the section in the text in this chapter about Japan and then come back to the lecture. And I mean, when you read it, what kind of images pop into your head? For me, I instantly pictured commonality with the 1950s North America, with the husband being primarily responsible for work and the woman being primarily responsible for children and home, and divorce being pretty rare. A very traditional gendered division of labor and gendered expectations affect every aspect of family life in Japan. And in Japan, while not the complete norm, multi-generational households are more common than in North America. Unlike India, the birth rate in Japan is declining on its own. This is because fewer women are marrying, and more women are marrying at a later age, meaning less time to have children, because they spend more time in school. And they simply don't want to get married young. They want to be single. I totally understand that. If you were a woman that wanted to get married at a relatively young age and have children, that's fine. I wouldn't criticize that at all because it's your own choice. But if you are a woman that didn't want to get married young, that's also your choice. And young women in Japan have more options now than they did previously. The role of women in society has shifted at least enough to provide them more choice. But there is a concern here. Just like a fertility rate can be too high, it can also be too low. And Japan's fertility rate is not even close to replacement levels, which will at some point in the future start to cause real problems economically and socially. Then we come to Sweden, and I have no problem saying I should have moved to Sweden a long time ago. When you look at how family is perceived by the government and just every day socially speaking, and how much support families are provided by the government and socially speaking. So you can read this in the textbook, but rather than just, drone on to you, I thought you'd like a few small videos explaining how great the situation in Sweden is. In one, it compares the UK to Sweden. And in the other, it's a man who lives in Sweden just talking about how great the benefits are for families in that country. Now, when I say how great Sweden is, yes, I am referring to the financial aspects of their system, how that benefits children and families. But I'm also referring to policies that are in place for families, as well as their specific emphasis on gender equality and treating mums and dads as similar as possible. So what this lecture does, and what this chapter in the textbook does, is try to provide you kind of like the basis. Think of the foundation of a house. It tries to provide you the foundation for understanding what this concept of a family is all about. And in doing that, to then look at families around the world in a comparative sense. Now, having said that, I'll be the first one to admit that the next topic for next week's class is going to be families throughout history. I personally feel that the author of the textbook could have made more of a distinction between these two topics. They really run together. You can't look at one without the other in the way that it's written in the textbook. And that's fine. But just be aware that what was discussed in this class will really be related in pretty much every way to what's discussed in the next class.